An ultimatum? Do you even know who you're talking to? We're the kings, and no king will ever accept an ultimatum. Go back to your general or commodore or whatever the fuck and tell them to shove their ultimatum where the sun don't shine.
You know when they say top tier is a privilege because it's a long task to grind up to it, and when you get there, your stock top tier gets infinitely wrecked by everyone that's been up there for years? Yeah, I do. The problem is this time, top tier is now a more exclusive club for people who grinded out the right nation. And that right nation? Who else but the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. When I made the Israeli video before the update dropped, I expected that the Panzer S1 won't do as much harm as other SPAs already in-game, even with a range of 20 kilometers, because for the most part, you could just fly over the radar's azimuth. That's why I made the remark that Israel didn't need a top-tier SPA to bolster their lineup. For the most part, the Nets and the Korna should have been fine in day battles, and to an extent maybe night battles if they buffed the AGM-65D's resolution. But anyways, unfortunately, the Panzer S1's range has rendered aircraft of other nations useless, if not rendered so difficult to use. If the Panzer S1 made close air support as a whole obsolete in a vacuum, it wouldn't be too much of a hassle, but the problem is it's made Russian aircraft, close air support aircraft to be exact, even more difficult to counter, and they've become so efficient that other nations just can't keep up. War Thunder's top-tier ground RB can be broken down into an engagement triangle of sorts. At the top of the triangle is close air support. This includes drones, helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft. One of the sides of the triangle are ground assets. MBTs, light tanks, IFVs, tank destroyers, basically anything intended to fight against other ground assets and capture points. And across the ground assets are the anti-air assets. These aren't limited to SPA, but also light tanks that can effectively engage helicopters and aircraft like the Suds 4 Dawn 9040 and the Beagle Panzer 57. Most nations excel at two of these, such as Sweden excelling in ground-to-ground and anti-air assets with the SCRV-122, CV-9120s, and the ITO-90M. Germany, for a brief moment, excelled in all three, with the Leopard 2A5, 2A6, Florakrad, and Tornado ASSTA-1. However, when the Panzer was added, it raised the playing field to a point that most nations can no longer compete, and it became a domino effect. The Panzer S1 could harass any aircraft sent to counter the Russian helicopters, and even if SPA were to counter them, the MiG-27Ks could just destroy the SPA because basically they have air superiority. Because of this, it's no longer uncommon for top-tier matches to have 4 or 5 helicopters in the Russian team and 2 or 3 MiG-27s in the latter half of the match. This makes top-tier severely one-sided, especially if you're playing nations that relied on fixed-wing aircraft for anti-air capabilities like Israel. Now, using cast-and-destroy SAM sites is now near impossible. The missile physics rework is only ever useful if you're flying perpendicular to the SAM site, in which case you can't aim your air-to-ground weapons. And on top of that, the Panzer has 12 missiles. If you miss with 12 missiles, you're probably worse than the worst War Thunder player. Then, if you do use up all 12 missiles, and the aircraft gets up close, you can use your 30mm cannons. At least in the case of the Tunguska, it lost sight of you if you climbed high enough. But because the search radar on the Panzer is angled upwards, there's very little room to hide in the sky now. Forget the contrails, even if they can see your contrails, you're still on their search radar, let alone their tracking radar. So let's talk about Russian close air support. The problem with the Vickers armed helicopters is not even the Vickers itself, even if it does have a 10-kilometer range with proxy fuse to counter SAMs and other aircraft. Though it is interesting to note that it has a lower guaranteed launch range for the Vickers, and unlike the Hellfire, which has the same guaranteed launch range as its actual range. Now, the problem with these helicopters is how easy it is to spawn them. You can spawn a helicopter at the very beginning of the game with just rockets, which shouldn't be a problem in most BRs, where the rockets are pretty weak and you need to get up close and accurate to actually get kills. But if you pair that with rocket CCIP and the S130F rockets, that's when it gets a bit annoying because it's really easy to get kills with a really huge rocket and you have CCIP to guide your shots. And because it's way easier to spawn a helicopter fully armed with 12 ATGMs in the case of the K-15, K-52 than a drone with only 2, helicopters become the choice of people who just want to farm for, say, an event that requires a mission score. And the KA-50, KA-52, and Mi-28NM provide a very good vessel to do that. And as if the helicopters aren't enough, the MiG-27K adds to these underlying issues. Because it can attack vertically in a dive from somewhere around 8,000 meters altitude, the SPAs that aren't the Panzer can't see them climbing and diving, and with 4 laser-guided ATGMs, it's of no difficulty to deal lasting damage to the enemy team. While there are also aircraft like the Su-17M4 and Su-22M3 as alternatives, the MiG-27K is by far the most effective and most widely used in this role. Then there are the tanks. Russia has one of the most, if not the most extensive tank lineup among other nations, except perhaps Great Britain. In the tech tree, you have 4 MBTs, the T-90, T-72B3, T-80U, and T-80BVM. If you count event vehicles and squadron vehicles, you can have as much as 6, if you include the T-80UK and the T-80UM2. Now, not everyone has all 6 tanks in the lineup, but even if you have the bare minimum of 2 tanks, if you only grind it down one line, you can already either use the T-80U and T-80BVM, or the T-90A and T-72B3, which can hold their own against the other team. The sheer speed of the BVM and B3 are enough to give tanks like the Ariete Challenger to the dry heaves. Not to mention the BVM is a very wonky damage model that allows it to survive most penetrating hits above the lower plate. In War Thunder, the only guaranteed weak spot of Soviet modern MBTs is the rear hemisphere. Any blow from the rear that goes through the fighting compartment can reasonably take out the crew compared to the side shots and frontal hits. When I said there's no Russian bias, I did mean that it's not impossible for Russia to lose. But this current update has made it very, very difficult to make that happen. During the event, I accrued a win rate of around 60% with USSR. That's considered above the norm, as most nations have around 51 to 55% win rates on average. I can even go as far as saying the top tier is basically unplayable in this state when USSR just nullifies the strengths of other nations by simply discarding the concept of parity. War Thunder's main selling point is that it doesn't use health bars or point systems to determine destruction, and instead they balance around what vehicles and weapon systems each nation uses against each other, so at least they achieve operational parity when they are in battle with each other. But now, with a Panzer that outclasses the next best SPA by a mile, parity simply cannot be achieved. Sure, it's historically authentic, but it's not achieving parity. And if you're marketing a game, a competitive game at that, you need to have parity. Now, because of this, people have started calling for seed to be added, ARMs. Now, I personally don't know if ARMs will save top tier, and Gaijin is currently not keen on doing it according to the response towards the community feedback before the update dropped. But we've seen them backtrack on many things like air-to-air missiles and all that, supersonic aircraft. But if ARMs and seed is to be added, it could help aircraft fight against the Panzers. However, this will be a power creep once again because the second earliest anti-rad missile for the US, the AGM-45 Shrike, has a range of 40 kilometers for the B variant. The AGM-78 standard arm, 90 kilometers, and the weakest AGM-88 Harm has a range of 25 kilometers. The only one that can be considered within a range of balance is the AGM-122 with a range of 16.5 kilometers, It is mounted on aircraft that aren't even at the Panzer's BR, like the AV-8C. So what's the easy short-term solution to fix these top-tier problems? Well, off the top of my head, it's to increase helicopter spawn point costs. A helicopter with 12 ATGMs can cost as much as 200 spawn points less than a drone with 2. An A-10A late with rockets and Mavericks, on the other hand, can cost as much as 50 to 60 spawn points more than a drone. If it's made harder to spawn helicopters, you'd see a lot less of them in the air. Another one is to nerf the range of the Panzer artificially. They did it when the R60 was introduced for the first time, only having 18 Gs of maximum overload instead of the full 30. But this one is a bit unlikely, because why sacrifice authenticity for balance, right? That's the entire point of the Panzer. A third solution that could work is to enlarge the limits of maps so that when aircraft spawn, they're not immediately within search range of the Panzer S1 radar. There are even maps where you can get tracked as far away as your own airfield, like in Sands of Sinai. So yeah, moving the airfield further away from each other as well as the air spawn points can potentially help mitigate the Panzer issues just a little bit. Because certainly adding equal SPAs is not possible for other countries. Italy, for one, does not have any SHORAD similar to the Panzer or ITO-90M. The ASPI doesn't have a ground-based self-propelled platform. The US and Sweden can have their AIM-9X and IRIS-T carriers because outside of the ADATs, their IADs are multi-vehicle networks with TELRs separate from their radar units. This is also the issue plaguing Japan and the TANSAM missile. While the TANSAM can use SACLOS to guide the missile without radar, it will rely on its optical tracker to see enemy aircraft if added without the fire-controlled vehicle. Arguably, you can use it to fire in the general direction of the target and just have the terminal IR seeking correct itself, but still. Now, while these changes may take more than 1 or 2 updates to rectify, the problem is that top tier is basically unplayable if you're not Russia now, at this very moment. The recent BR changes did slightly help nations form new BRs they can be effective in that isn't top tier, but it's still not very conducive to gameplay to soft lock certain nations out of playing a certain BR because it's just impossible for them to perform, so you can have your way with a different nation. This event was most frustrating to me grinding out the Arya to AMV. I have to admit, I almost lost my sanity there because it's simply that difficult to play as Italy without any air support capability. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Now that the event is over for the most part, the next thing to look forward to is either the new Battle Pass and the devblog season for the second update. Devblog season should start by the end of this month or earlier, and the update should drop around the end of May to mid-June at the latest. This is the Dr. MD. Keep your sanity while grinding tanks. Godspeed.